Robert Miller had lived in the same Connecticut home for more than 30 years, a place where every corner still whispered the laughter of his late wife, Margaret. Just 2 weeks earlier, he had laid her to rest, and now the silence of the house pressed on him like a weight. What should have been a sanctuary of memories was quickly turning into a battleground. His son, David, and daughter, Susan, arrived under the guise of concern. They spoke softly at first, telling Robert the house was too big, too costly, and too much for him to manage alone. But beneath their words was an urgency he couldn't ignore. Robert soon discovered the truth. His own children had already contacted a realtor, eager to sell the family home and pocket the profits. It was in that moment, watching David's impatience and Susan's rehearsed sympathy, that Robert realized something chilling. His children cared less about him and more about what he owned. Still raw with grief, he now faced betrayal from the two people he had believed he could trust most. This was the beginning of a battle Robert never asked for, but one he could no longer avoid. What none of them knew was that Margaret had left behind more than memories. She had prepared for this moment, leaving Robert both a secret and a choice that would change everything. The tension in the Miller household only grew heavier with each passing day. Robert wanted to grieve quietly, to take his time sorting through Margaret's belongings, but David and Susan seemed determined to rush him. They returned again and again, pressing the same arguments. "Dad, the upkeep on this place is too much for you. You'd be better off somewhere smaller, maybe a nice apartment or a retirement condo." Robert knew their tone. It wasn't care, it was calculation. When he finally challenged them, asking why they were so eager to push him out, David let it slip. They had already spoken to a potential buyer. They weren't suggesting change for his benefit. They were orchestrating a sale behind his back. That revelation cut deeper than Robert expected. For years he had believed his children respected the home he and Margaret had built, brick by brick, memory by memory. Instead, he saw them now as opportunists, circling an inheritance before its time. And then came the moment that shifted everything. As the three of them sat around the worn oak dining table, David pushed a stack of papers toward him. "Just think about signing, Dad. This way, you won't have to worry anymore." Robert's hand trembled, not with fear but with anger. He looked his son in the eye and said evenly, "This house was paid off 6 years ago, your mother made." Sure of that, the silence that followed was deafening. Susan blinked, caught off guard. David's jaw tightened, his rehearsed pitch collapsing in an instant. They hadn't known. Margaret, ever the planner, had quietly handled the final payments without telling anyone Evan Robert, till she revealed it to him months before her passing. Now that truth struck like a hammer. Robert saw their faces shift, first shock, then calculation again. They hadn't expected the mortgage to be gone. Their strategy had relied on the burden of debt as leverage. With that gone, their facade of concern crumbled. For Robert, the moment was bittersweet. Pride welled up in him at the thought of Margaret's foresight. Even after her death, she was protecting him. But sadness followed quickly behind. His children's first reaction wasn't relief that their father was secure, it was frustration that their plan had been disrupted. In that instant, Robert knew he couldn't simply trust their words anymore. They weren't looking out for him, they were looking out for themselves. It was a painful truth for any parent, but especially for a man still raw with grief. Later that night, as he sat alone in the quiet of Margaret's study, Robert whispered, "To the empty room, you were right, Margaret. I always saw further than I did." The realization was clear. If David and Susan were already scheming now, they would not stop. They would find new ways to pressure him, new tactics to corner him. The house was only the beginning. Robert leaned back in the chair, his eyes scanning the rows of books Margaret loved so much. He remembered her words, spoken in passing years ago. "You've got to be ready for the day when people stop seeing you as family and start seeing you as a ledger." At the time, he had laughed it off. Now, her warning echoed louder than ever. As dawn broke the next morning, Robert made a decision. He would no longer play defense, would begin preparing not only to protect the home he and Margaret had built, but to safeguard the last pieces of dignity and freedom he had left. What David and Susan didn't know, what they could not possibly imagine, was that Margaret had left behind more than just a paid-off house. Somewhere in this home, Robert felt certain, lay the answers she had hidden for him, clues, perhaps even a plan that would allow him to turn the tide. And so, with a heavy heart but newfound resolve, Robert rose from his chair, determined to search through Margaret's belongings with fresh eyes. He wasn't just looking for keepsakes anymore. He was looking for the truth, the kind of truth that could save him from his own children. Robert spent hours in Margaret's study, carefully going through her drawers, files, and boxes. Most of what he found brought bittersweet memories: birthday cards she had saved, recipes written in her elegant handwriting, photographs of vacations long past. But beneath the nostalgia was something heavier, something hidden. And when Robert discovered the blue folder tucked deep in the bottom drawer, his heart knew instantly this was what Margaret had wanted him to find. Inside, he found documents that made his hands shake. Separate bank accounts Margaret had maintained for years. A life insurance policy in Emily's name, their only granddaughter. And most shocking of all, the deed to a villa on the coast of Florida, registered under Margaret's name alone. Alongside it was correspondence from a Miami law firm, detailing ownership rights and long-term caretaking arrangements. But it wasn't the papers that brought Robert to tears. It was the letter. Written in Margaret's familiar handwriting, the words seemed to reach across the grave. "Robert, if you are reading this, it means my time is past. And if David and Susan are pressing you, then my fears have come true. Our children may one day see you as a burden, not as their father. The Florida villa is yours. Use it as your safe harbor if you ever need to walk away." Robert pressed the letter to his chest. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel entirely alone. Margaret had been watching out for him, even after her death. She had seen what he had refused to admit, that their children's ambition might one day outweigh their love. When David and Susan returned a few days later, they were more aggressive. They no longer spoke in gentle tones or with feigned sympathy. Instead, they came with a lawyer, pressing harder than ever for Robert to make practical decisions about the house and his estate. This time, Robert did not remain quiet. He sat across from them at the dining table, the same one where so many family dinners had been shared, and looked directly into his son's eyes. "You think you can pressure me into selling?" he said calmly. "But you're wrong. This house is not a burden. It was paid off 6 years ago. Your mother made sure of it. She didn't do that for you. She did it for me and for the memory of the life we built here together." The room went still. Susan's face paled. David's jaw locked. The lawyer glanced nervously at his papers, realizing the entire foundation of their argument had crumbled. For Robert, it was a moment of clarity. His wife's foresight had disarmed their plan. But even as he held his ground, a deep sadness lingered. It wasn't victory he felt, it was loss. The mortgage being paid off should have been a source of family pride. Instead, it exposed the truth that his children had never cared about his comfort. They only cared about their inheritance. Later that evening, Robert sat alone in his living room. The house was quiet, but his mind was racing. Margaret had given him the means to protect himself. The villa in Florida was more than property. It was an escape route, a second chance at peace. But was he ready to use it? He thought about Emily, his granddaughter, the only one Margaret had trusted enough to name in the insurance policy. Robert realized Margaret hadn't just been protecting him. She had been protecting the next generation too. The one person in the family who still carried innocence and love, untainted by greed. Robert folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the folder. He knew now that his days of passive grieving were over. If David and Susan wanted a battle over his life, they would get one. But he would not fight unprepared. Margaret had handed him both a shield and a sword, and he intended to use them. As he turned off the lights and prepared for bed, Robert whispered softly into the darkness, "I hear you, Margaret. I'll finish what you started." The discovery of Margaret's hidden folder marked a turning point for Robert Miller. What began as grief and confusion was now shifting into something sharper resolve. Every page of that folder revealed just how carefully Margaret had thought ahead. Anticipating a storm Robert hadn't wanted to see, he sat in her study night after night, reading and rereading the documents. There were bank accounts Margaret had opened in her own name, balances she had quietly built over decades of thrift. There was the life insurance policy, small but meaningful, naming only their granddaughter Emily as beneficiary. And then, the most stunning piece, the deed to a villa on the Florida coast. The villa was no modest cottage. It was a well-maintained two-story retreat with white stucco walls, blue shutters, and an ocean view described in detail in the correspondence from a Miami law firm. Margaret had purchased it years ago in her own name, quietly paying taxes and upkeep through an appointed caretaker. She had left everything in order, as though she knew Robert would need it someday. But the heart of it all was the letter. Robert unfolded it so many times the creases began to wear thin. In Margaret's familiar script, she wrote, "Robert, I know you trust the children, but I cannot share that same faith. If they ever see you as an obstacle, not a father, this villa will give you the freedom to walk away. Be afraid. To use it, it's yours now." Those words cut him deeply, because they were both a comfort and a heartbreak. Margaret had loved their children, but she had also seen the shadows in them, the entitlement, the hunger for control. And she had been right. Robert didn't wait long to act. He reached out to the Miami attorney listed in the documents, a man named Peter Alvarez. Over a phone call that stretched nearly an hour, Peter confirmed what Robert needed to hear. Villa was fully under his ownership, and the title was secure. Margaret had been meticulous. No loopholes, no debts, no surprises. "You have every legal right to the property," Peter said firmly. "And if your children attempt to pressure you, I can have CI and desist letters drawn up immediately." Robert thanked him, his voice unsteady. For the first time since Margaret's passing, he felt a measure of safety. He wasn't powerless. He wasn't cornered. The next day, Robert drove into town and opened a private P.O. box. He purchased a new binder and began organizing every document with care. Then, almost on impulse, he went online and booked a one-way ticket to Miami. He chose a refundable fare, telling himself it was just in case. But in his heart, he knew he was already preparing for the possibility of leaving everything behind. He even started keeping notes in a small leather journal. On the first page, he drew 3 columns. The headings read, "What they know, what they don't, what I want them to think." Under each, he began writing carefully, outlining truths, half-truths, and the illusions he might need to maintain. It felt strange, even ruthless, but it also felt necessary. As Robert worked, memories of Margaret seemed to guide his hand. He could almost hear her voice reminding him to stay one step ahead. She had left him the tools. And now, it was his responsibility to use them wisely. When David and Susan called later that week, their tone was sharper. They wanted to check in, but their questions were pointed. "Have you thought more about selling? Have you spoken to anyone about listing?" Robert kept his voice calm, almost casual. "I'm still considering my options," he said, offering nothing more. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that his plan had already begun. That night, after hanging up the phone, Robert looked around the quiet house. It no longer felt like a trap. It felt like a staging ground. Every photograph on the wall, every drawer in Margaret's study, reminded him of a truth he could no longer ignore. He had something worth protecting, and he wouldn't surrender. It too agreed, as he closed the blue folder and slid it back into its hiding place. Robert whispered to the darkness, "Don't worry, Margaret. I won't let them win." Robert Miller had always trusted Margaret to handle the details of life, but now he understood just how far her foresight extended. She hadn't only purchased the Florida villa, she had secured it with meticulous care. With the documents in his possession and attorney Peter Alvarez's assurances still ringing in his ears, Robert finally felt as though the ground beneath him was steady again, but stability was not enough. Margaret's letter had carried both a warning and a call to action. If David and Susan were already scheming against him, then he needed to be ready not simply to resist, but to outmaneuver them. He began quietly setting things in order. The Pooh box became his lifeline, a place where sensitive mail could arrive without passing through curious hands. Each day, Robert would drive into town under the pretense of errands, retrieving envelopes and carefully filing them in his binder. At home next came his finances. With Peter's guidance, Robert shifted small portions of money from joint accounts into the ones Margaret had opened for him. It wasn't about hoarding wealth. It was about creating independence. The last thing he wanted was for David or Susan to claim he was incapable of managing his own affairs. And then there was the villa itself. Robert called Anna, the caretaker Margaret had entrusted years earlier. Her voice was warm with a slight Spanish lilt. "Mr. Miller," she said kindly, "your wife was a wise woman. She told me once that this house would be your sanctuary. Everything here is well maintained. The keys are waiting for you." Those words sent a shiver through Robert. It was as though Margaret's hand was still guiding him, leading him toward safety. At night, he returned to the leather journal, filling pages with his 3 columns. What they know, what they don't, what I want them to think, in what they know. He listed the obvious. He was grieving, he was vulnerable, and he was still living in the Connecticut house. In what they don't, he wrote in bold letters, the villa, the accounts, and Peter Alvarez. And under what I want them to think, he wrote, undecided, passive, easy to push. It was a painful exercise, pretending to play weak when all he wanted was to roar back. But Margaret's wisdom reminded him patience was power. If David and Susan believed he was hesitant, they would overplay their hand. That prediction proved correct. Within days, they arrived at the house again, this time with an even sharper edge. Their lawyer sat beside them at the dining room table, pen in hand, ready to push paperwork. But Robert was ready. He listened to their rehearsed lines, their thinly veiled warnings about how difficult it might be for him to manage things on his own. When the moment came, he leaned forward and said calmly, "You may think I'm a burden you can rearrange, but you're wrong. I am not a resource to be managed. This house is not for sale." The lawyer stammered, unprepared for Robert's firmness. David flushed red. Susan looked away. For the first time, Robert saw them shaken. That night, though, the victory felt hollow. He sat in his armchair, staring at Margaret's photograph on the mantel. Yes, he had stood his ground, but he knew his children well enough to realize they wouldn't give up. If anything, they would come at him harder now. Margaret's letter echoed in his mind. "The villa is your safe harbor." Robert exhaled, his decision settling into place like a stone. He would not only defend himself, he would prepare to leave, if it came to that. And when he did, he would do so on his own terms, carrying with him the dignity that Margaret had fought to preserve. He closed his journal for the night, whispering softly into the quiet house, "I hear you, Margaret. I'm ready." By now, Robert Miller had shifted from a grieving widower to a man quietly sharpening his defenses. Margaret's foresight had opened his eyes, and he was determined not to let their children's greed corner him again. The leather journal on his desk was no longer just notes. It was becoming a roadmap to freedom. Every morning, Robert poured himself a black coffee and sat down at the kitchen table to add to his 3 columns, what they know, what they don't, what I want them to think. He updated it like a general revising battle plans. Under what they know, he wrote, "Dad is tired, vulnerable, undecided." Under what they don't, he added, Vila confirmed, caretaker waiting. And under what I want them to think, he underlined, still hesitant. Considering, it was a mask he would wear for as long as it took. Behind the scenes, Robert began moving with precision. He called Peter Alvarez, the attorney in Miami, and arranged for protective letters to be drafted, documents that would make it clear David and Susan had no authority over his estate. He drove to the post office to check his new P.O. box, sliding envelopes into his binder, building a fortress of paperwork that only he controlled. Then came the more delicate steps. Robert bought a one-way ticket to Miami, scheduled for 3 months out. It was refundable, but he treated it as more than a piece of paper. It was a promise to himself. He also spoke regularly with Anna, the villa's caretaker, who assured him that everything was ready. "The house is in perfect condition." "Mr. Miller," she said warmly over the phone, "your wife wanted it kept just as she left it. All you need to do is come." Those words carried him through the lonely nights. Still, Robert knew appearances mattered. He began sorting through the house, but not in the way David and Susan expected. He made 3 neat piles in the living room, labeling them with sticky notes, go, stay, travel. Into go, he placed anything tied to David and Susan's childhood trophies, boxes of clothes, photo albums they'd left behind. Into stay, he set Margaret's cherished belongings, the pieces of their life he couldn't bear to part with yet. And into travel, he carefully folded clothes, set aside passports, and tucked away essentials. It was a quiet ritual, one that steadied him. For years, Robert had allowed his children to believe he was predictable, even pliable. Now, he was playing a role, preparing for the moment he would show them otherwise. Asterisk, when David and Susan stopped by, they found him subdued, even agreeable. He listened to their repeated arguments about selling the house and offered non-committal answers. "I'll think about it," he said. "Maybe you're right." In truth, he was already 10 steps ahead. Late one evening, after they left, Rubette sat back in Margaret's study and reviewed the latest legal documents from Peter. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Cease and desist letters. We're ready. The villa secured. The financial accounts locked down beyond his children's reach. For the first time since Margaret's funeral. Robert felt something stir inside him, a sense of control, even pride. He was no longer simply reacting to his children's betrayal. He was preparing to outmaneuver them entirely. He stood by the window, looking out over the yard, where he and Margaret had once planted roses together. The night air was cool and the house seemed to hum with her presence. "You always said I'd have to be strong one day," he whispered. "I think that day's here," and as he closed the curtains. Robert knew the next move would be his. The weeks that followed were a delicate balancing act for Robert Miller. On the surface, he appeared the weary widower, still grieving, still undecided, still vulnerable. But beneath that exterior, he was prepared. Every document was in order, every piece of his plan secured. He was waiting for the moment he knew would come, the showdown with his children. It arrived one chilly Saturday morning. David's SUV pulled into the driveway first, followed closely by Susan's sedan. Both stepped out, dressed in business casual, their expressions firm, their movements coordinated. They hadn't come for a visit, they'd come for a fight. Robert greeted them at the door with quiet politeness. He led them into the dining room, the same table where Margaret had hosted countless Thanksgiving dinners, where laughter once filled the air. Now, the atmosphere was heavy. The table covered with neatly stacked folders Robert had prepared. David began almost immediately, sliding a packet of documents across the polished oak. "Dad, we've been patient. But we need to think about the future. This house is too much for you. It's not safe. It's not practical. Selling is the best option." Susan leaned in, her tone softer, but no less manipulative. "We only want what's best for you, Dad. We don't want you to struggle here alone." Robert let the silence stretch, studying the faces of the children he had raised. For a moment, he searched for the warmth. He remembered the boy who used to build model airplanes in the garage, the girl who once helped her mother bake cookies on Christmas Eve, but those children were long gone. What sat before him now were adults driven by greed, treating him as a hurdle to be cleared. Finally, Robert spoke, his voice calm but edged with steel. "You've mistaken me for someone who doesn't know his own mind. Let me make this clear. I am not a resource to be managed. I am your father. And this house is not for sale." The words landed like a hammer blow. David's face reddened. "Dad, you're being unreasonable. You can't keep living like this. You're making things harder on everyone." Robert leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "So you struggling? Are the two of you struggling to accept that you can't control me?" Susan's lips parted as if to object, but she faltered under his steady stare. For the first time, the balance of power had shifted. The lawyer they had brought along shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly unprepared for Robert's firmness. The neat little plan they had rehearsed had unraveled in a matter of minutes. Robert didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The authority in his tone was enough. "Your mother and I built this home together. She made sure it was ours, free and clear. If you thought you could guilt me into giving it up, you were wrong. This conversation is over." He pushed the documents back across the table toward David, the gesture final and unyielding. The silence that followed was thick. David clenched his fists. Susan looked down at her hands. At last, without another word, they gathered their papers and left the house. When the door closed behind them, Robert exhaled deeply, his hands trembling just slightly. It had taken every ounce of strength to remain composed.
Ow!
But he had done it. He had stood his ground. Later that night, as he sat in the quiet living room, Robert gazed at Margaret's photograph. The confrontation had not ended the battle, it had only escalated it. He knew his children would return with new schemes, new angles, but something inside him had shifted. He was no longer the passive man they assumed he was. He was a husband honoring his wife's foresight, a father reclaiming his dignity, and a man prepared to fight for his freedom. And in that moment, Robert whispered to the photograph on the mantel, "They underestimated me, Margaret, but they won't make that mistake again." The confrontation with David and Susan had left Robert Miller both exhausted and emboldened. He knew his children would not stop. Their faces when he refused, shock shifting to anger, told him everything. They had expected compliance, a signature, a surrender. Instead, they had found a father who would not be managed. But Robert also understood something important. Words alone would not be enough. If he wanted to protect his peace, he needed to take action. He had to show them clearly and unmistakably the balance of power had changed. So he began sorting through the house with new purpose. For days he moved room to room, opening closets, rifling through boxes, pulling out every belonging. That tied David and Susan to the home. Old trophies, childhood toys, yearbooks, photo albums, items they had left behind but never bothered to claim. He boxed them carefully, labeling each one with their names. Into David's pile went the model, airplanes he'd once built, the high school football jacket that still smelled faintly of sweat and grass. Into Susan's winter prom dress, her college textbooks, the porcelain figurines she had collected as a girl. When the boxers were sealed, Robert hired a moving service. He instructed the movers to deliver them directly to his children's homes, and inside each box, he placed a simple handwritten note. "I am returning what belongs to you, and I am keeping what belongs to me." It was a quiet act, but a powerful one. The deliveries landed like thunderbolts. David called first, his voice sharp with anger. "Dad, what is this supposed to mean? You're just being petty." Robert didn't flinch. "It means the things you left here are no longer my responsibility. I've given you back your past. As for this house, it is mine, and it stays that way." Susan was quieter, but no less shaken. She sent a text that evening. "Dad, are you really doing this? It feels like you're shutting us out." Robert stared at the screen for a long moment before replying, "I am setting boundaries." There's a difference. For Robert, the act of returning those boxes was more than symbolic. It was liberation. Each package that left the house lightened his burden. For too long, the home had been filled with reminders of what David and Susan used to be the children he loved.
Ow.
Before ambition hardened their hearts. By sending those things back, he was reclaiming the house as his own. That night, after the movers finished, Robert sat in the living room surrounded by silence. The space felt different, lighter, freer. For the first time since Margaret's passing, the house didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a home again, one he had chosen to protect. Yet Robert knew his gesture would not go unanswered. His children would see it not just as defiance, but as a direct challenge. And that was exactly the point. They needed to understand he would no longer be coerced, no longer manipulated. The next evening, as Robert filed away the latest correspondence from Peter Alvarez, he paused to reflect. Margaret's letter had urged him to be strong, to prepare. For betrayal, she had given him the villa as a shield, but the fight for his dignity had to be waged here. In the home they had built together, by sending those boxes away, Robert had taken his first real step in that battle. He had drawn a line his children could not ignore. He stood at the front door looking out at the darkened street. Somewhere beyond, David and Susan were fuming, stewing in their frustration. But here, in the quiet glow of his home, Robert felt something he hadn't in months control. Softly, he whispered into the night air, "I'm holding my ground, Margaret, and I won't let them take it from me." Asterisk, it didn't take long for Robert Miller's bold gesture to ignite a storm. The boxes had barely settled on David's front porch before the phone calls began, first sharp, then furious, then cutting off altogether. Robert expected it. What he didn't expect was how quickly David would show up in person. It was a gray Sunday afternoon when Robert heard the pounding at his front door. He opened it to find David standing there, his face red with anger, fists clenched at his sides. "Dad," David barked, stepping inside without waiting for permission. "What the hell is this? You send me boxes of junk with some smug little note? You're acting selfish. You're not thinking about anyone but yourself." Robert shut the door calmly. Turning to face his son, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His steadiness was disarming enough. "I thought it was clear," Robert said evenly. "I gave you back what belongs to you. I'm keeping what belongs to me. That's not selfishness. That's fairness." David threw his arms wide in exasperation. "Fairness? You're sitting here in this big house, rattling around alone, and you call that fairness? Mom's gone, and you're just clinging to the past. It's pathetic. You should be thinking about your family, about us." Robert's gaze hardened. "Your mother was my family, and this house is the life we built together. If you think I'll let you strip that away from me, you're mistaken." For a moment, father and son stood locked in silence, the tension thick enough to choke on. Robert's mind flashed 2 years earlier, when he had stood on these same floors teaching David how to tie a necktie, how to drive a car, how to shake a man's hand with confidence. Now that boy was gone, replaced by a man whose hunger for inheritance had blinded him to loyalty. David shook his head, his voice rising. "You're being stubborn, Dad. This is why Susan and I have to step in. You're not capable of managing all this anymore?" Robert felt the sting of those words, but he didn't flinch. He drew a slow breath, then answered with quiet resolve, "Don't confuse refusal with incapability. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. What I won't allow is for my own children to treat me like a burden to be handled." The finality in his tone made David falter. His anger cracked for just a moment, revealing something raw, perhaps guilt, perhaps fear. But pride quickly swept it away. "Fine," David snapped. "If you want to play this game, go ahead. Don't expect us to be there when you finally realize you can't handle it." Robert nodded once, his expression calm. That's your choice. But I'll tell you this. David, don't come back here expecting me to bend. Those days are over." The words hung in the air like a closing door. David opened his mouth as if to fire back, but then stopped. With a frustrated huff, he turned on his heel and stormed out, slamming the front door so hard the windows rattled. The house fell into silence again. Robert stood for a long moment, breathing slowly, steadying himself. Confrontations like this drained him, but they also steeled him. Each one confirmed what Margaret had written in her letter. The children would try to strip him of control, and each one reminded him that he had the strength to stop them. That evening, Robert returned. To his journal, "Under what they know," he added, "Dad refuses to sell, refuses to bend. Under what they don't," he circled in bold letters, "Florida villa, backup plan. And under what I want them to think," he scribbled, "still vulnerable, but stubborn." Closed the book, leaned back in his chair, and let out a long exhale. The storm was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, Robert felt certain. He was no longer the one being cornered. Looking up at Margaret's photograph, he whispered softly, "I stood my ground today. You'd have been proud." The weeks that followed David's angry outbursts brought Robert Miller a strange sense of calm. He'd endured his children's pressure, their manipulation, their thinly veiled threats, and he had not bent. Letter had given him strength, but the courage he carried now was his own. For the first time since her passing, Robert wasn't just surviving. He was living with intention. He moved through the house deliberately, sorting and deciding. Each drawer he opened, each item he placed into the categories of go, stay, travel, felt like reclaiming ownership of his life. By returning the boxes of his children's belongings, he had lifted a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. The home no longer felt like a warehouse of their forgotten pasts. It was his sanctuary again, filled only with what mattered to him. Then came the documents from Lisbon, confirming his inheritance of the Florida villa. Robert held the official papers in his hands, the embossed seal shining under the lamp. It was all real. The house by the sea, with its bright walls and ocean view, wasn't just an escape hatch, it was a new beginning. He pictured Margaret there, smiling on the terrace. As the sun set, her hand resting gently on his. She had planned it all for him, knowing he would one day need a safe harbor. And now, he understood it wasn't only a retreat from his children's greed, it was a place to honor her memory by living fully once more. So Robert made his final moves. He packed the travel pile into 2 neat suitcases, sliding them into the closet by the front door. He called the movers, instructing them to deliver the last of David's and Susan's boxers. With each departure, he felt the walls of the house breathe easier. And then, one quiet morning, he sealed the gesture with an act of dignity. He wrote personal notes to each of his children, tucked inside the boxes that were being delivered. I am returning what belongs to you, and I am keeping what belongs to me. Simple, clear, undeniable. When the delivery truck pulled away for the final time, Robert sat in his living room and let the silence wrap around him. For years, he had been the father who gave, who bent, who carried. Now, he was the man who stood. Firm. The phone rang that evening, and as expected, David's voice was sharp, accusing, furious. But Robert no longer felt the tremor of fear. He spoke with steady authority, setting boundaries that could not be crossed. And when David's anger spilled over into insults, Robert ended the call with a quiet dignity that spoke louder than any argument. He turned to Margaret's photograph on the mantel. I did it, he whispered. I finally stood my ground. And with that, Robert realized something profound. It wasn't about the house, or the money, or even the villa. It was about dignity, about refusing to let those you love most reduce you to a possession to be handled. Margaret had seen that truth long before he had, and through her foresight, she had given him the strength to discover it for himself. Robert's story is a reminder that boundaries are not selfish, they are essential. No matter how old we are, no matter how much we've given to others, we have the right to protect our dignity and live on our own terms. Sometimes love means saying no even to family. If you've ever stood your ground in the face of pressure, or learned to protect your worth when others tried to take advantage, we'd love to hear your story. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your wisdom might be the encouragement someone else needs, and if Robert's journey moved you, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more powerful stories of resilience, justice, and the unshakable strength of the human spirit.